Next, we are going to get into a presentation by Micheal Tlusty from New England Aquarium, and he is right over to my right. So please welcome Micheal.
Thank you. Flavio, that was a great lead-in, not only because basically I'm going to reiterate everything Flavio just said, except instead of coffee, we're going to talk about shrimp. But the other thing is this is actually work that initially was funded by IDH many, many years ago. It's just the science process is not always fast or mighty. So whenever a goal meets, we're always kind of in a bubble. We're so focused on what GAA is doing, what we're doing. There's a big, big world out there, especially when you're talking about certification. And the question is, when you have this many certifications, and if you look at just standards map, I queried this maybe 6 months ago, 211 total certifications listed in standards map, 25% dealt with fisheries or aquaculture. That's a lot of wheat and chaff to sort through. So the question is, how are they functioning? Do they even work together? Do they even pay attention to each other? And so my belief is that sustainability and the goal to aquaculture improvement, we're crossing a river. And to get across that river, we need stepping stones. You can't just jump all the way across big rivers. And so what we have is we have different certifications, and if you structure them correctly, you can actually cross and you can actually make much more progress, much faster than if they're all clustered in the middle and you're trying to jump all the way out to the middle of the river. And I don't jump well, so I would probably fall in. So if you think about the typical thought about aquaculture is that we have environmental impacts, and we have high environmental impacts and low environmental impacts, and we have a few really good producers, we have a lot of average producers, we have some really bad producers. And so the idea is that we actually want to certify at different levels, because what we do is we take this really bad farmer down here and we pull him up to this one. And then that gets him into the next realm, and then we move him up. And then that gets him into the next realm, and we move him up. And you have to face the certification in both the regulatory environment, and so that has to keep pace, and that has to keep pushing up that bottom end and keep making it better. And to that end, I'd like to give a huge shout out to GAA for their work in Saudi Arabia and Colombia, where they're actually using their standard as, in the case of Saudi Arabia, de facto country level standard. So they're actually getting that bar moving up. And as we talked earlier today, innovation. You know, once you've met every single certification, there's still room for improvement. There's always something you can do. You know, you can go out to the very best farm in the world, and you can immediately see 10 ways to make it better. And that's what we can't lose track of is, once you gain certification, it's not a stopping point, okay? We're not talking about sustainable, we're talking about sustainability. Sustainable's an endpoint, and you land and you're done. No more improvement. Sustainability is what's the next thing? What's the next driver to keep you going? So we wanted to look at this with shrimp standards, and so we picked 3 international voluntary standard, the BAP program, Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and Global Gap, and then we compared that to the Thailand, the Vietnam, and the Indonesia programs as well. And what we did is we started out with the FAO technical guidelines for shrimp certification. And we started there because that was globally recognized standard. It was kind of the baseline, looking at that as the foundation upon which to build. And we took 112 different sectors and we divided them into environmental protection, social issues, and community, feed, supply risk, which is disease, the use of antibiotics, so anything that causes risk, and food safety. And again, I want to reiterate that this is just working off of the FAO guidelines. Especially I want to point out food safety. In the case of GAA, they're well known for their food safety mandate of the standard, and they have many factors above and beyond what FAO suggests are necessary. Those don't really come into this analysis because we kind of need the common baseline across which to compare everything. So how do you look at a problem? Well, this is Heaven Lake. It has an area, or what we're going to call a breadth, and it's 9.82 kilometers. But this is a very special lake in China because it's the deepest lake in China. So if you look at the area of the lake, or the breadth of it, you only see one piece of it, but you actually have to look at the depth to actually understand fully what is the true scale of this lake. So we can do the same thing in certification. We have the breadth down here, and this is just what % of factors are being addressed. So for example, when we talk about those 112 criteria divided across 5 areas, they're not divided evenly. Feed only has 9, the environment has 35. So what we looked at is what % were actually covered. So if you have a narrow scope, you only look at a couple of them. You only look at 1 out of 9 feed issues. If you have a broad scope, you look at 100% or 9 out of 9 feed issues. Likewise, on the depth, we have 0 if it's not covered. And then we have basically 1, is it just legal compliance? We go up to 3, which are best management practices. And 7 are aspirational metrics that are really pushing the ball forward. So we've done this, this breadth and depth scale. And what you get is you just get a very limited, if you're down in this quadrant, it's very limited. You're looking at a few things and really only making sure it's legal compliance. This would be a single issue, like antibiotic free, but you care about nothing else. Okay? You can kind of have broad but general. You're looking at a lot of things, but you're only, again, making sure it's legal compliance. And finally, just a big, comprehensive, consistent. And really what we want to do is we want to be moving up towards this quadrant. Okay, we want very broad scopes, and we want as aspirational as possible. So if we look at the BAP program, we can see they get plotted out for the different levels. Environment is E, C is social and community, F is feed, R is supply risk, and S is food safety. And again, there's some variation between them. And again, I would like to point out that this is an FAO criteria. There are actually additional standards that the BAP asks for, which are not reflected on this graph. But in doing this, we can see some variation, and what we can actually do is set up an average and a confidence interval. So this is basically looking at what's the average distribution of all 5 of these areas for BAP. The good thing is we can then take that and we can compare all of the 6 certification programs we've actually looked at. So if you notice, the big thing that comes out is that the national certifications tend to be lower depth and lower breadth than the voluntary certification programs. But look at this cluster that's happening up here. There's really no differentiation. And think about that for a minute. How are we going to improve when everybody's just competing in the same space? You know, any economists out there, Hotelling's law of minimum differentiation, things always kind of collapse down towards the average center. This is what we're doing in aquaculture, and this is what we need to stop. So much to Flavio's point, we need to be talking to each other, we need to be making sure these differences exist, and we need to actually make a pathway where we can actually march from a national program to one voluntary standard to another voluntary standard. And then what we need to do is we even need to keep pushing this off the chart and continue to improve. The other way I'd like to look at these data are, instead of looking at it from a program standpoint, let's look at it from an impact standpoint. And again, this actually, at least in the US, it tracks well with food safety. Buyers are interested in safe food, and that's where, if you look across all certification programs, they tend to be much stronger in the food safety than they do. Risk, again, disease and antibiotics. And actually, community is kind of the third. And again, feed. I mean, we've pointed it out ad nauseum. You're tired of hearing about it, but it is the laggard, and it is the thing that we need to pick up. So this breadth depth analysis, it was able to visually represent a lot of differences between rigor, between the different standards. And again, the big thing we saw is that the voluntary standards were operating at a level higher, both in breadth and depth, than the national standards. and some of it is we did see like, some of the national standards were just missing entire components of like feed or primarily feed. That was a big problem. Some of the differences are a methodological approach by the standards. The global gap, they're really interested in best management practices. They're not really interested in setting aspirational standards out there. So in this method, they will score low. So you do pick up some of those issues as well. And really, this sort of analysis is useful, but it really is coming down to we do need to focus on the issues. We need to, again, work cooperatively, take those components that all the certifications are meeting equally and put them aside and figure out which are the ones that we actually can have the most impact on. And finally, I've published this paper, and it's here. If anybody wants a copy, you can email me. I did some more detailed analysis, and part of the reason statistics exist is to find differences. And so you actually using much more detailed statistical analyses, you actually can find differences. But again, I think we really should be, at the consumer level, we should be concerned about this just average blush, and are we really differentiating ourselves? And I don't think as an aquaculture industry, and I'm talking about the industry as a whole, we really need to do a better job of differentiating, because that'll make it easier for buyers and consumers to understand the steps towards continual improvement. Thank you.